Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive.
Glad to be back. We've got a lot to get into today.
We really do. Today we are plunging headfirst into a stack of sources about the recent, really volatile events centered primarily in Los Angeles. We're talking about a wave of immigration enforcement actions, the protests that just erupted, and the multi-layered government response that followed.
That's right. What you sent over, it's a fascinating collection. You've got articles, official reports, legal filings, even some really striking first-person accounts. It gives us a really broad range of perspectives and details on something that's clearly not a simple story.
Absolutely. And you see everything in there from the official statements justifying the enforcement and, the legal battles that ensued to the raw observations from people right there on the ground and even the historical context that, according to these sources, is pretty crucial for understanding what's happening now.
It's so vital to look at all those angles, isn't it? You see how the exact same event can be described in, well, fundamentally different ways depending on who's experiencing it or, frankly, who's reporting on it.
Yeah, exactly. So our mission with this deep dive is to try and cut through some of that complexity, to really unpack what happened, who the sources say was involved, explore those different viewpoints presented, and, try to synthesize what it all might mean for the bigger picture.
Sounds like a plan. Let's dive into the details from the sources and see what kind of insights emerge when you lay it all out.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting with the spark that, according to these sources, really ignited this whole sequence of events. The immigration enforcement actions carried out by ICE.
Right. The sources pinpoint Friday, June 6th as the day this specifically kicked off.
And these weren't just like random individual arrests, were they? The sources describe pretty coordinated raids happening across the LA area.
Coordinated and targeted, yeah. They hit specific types of locations where immigrants are known to work or, gather. And we're talking places like a Home Depot, various garment factories, warehouses, and even street vendor locations spread throughout the city.
Hitting multiple locations like that simultaneously, it sounds like it would create an immediate and, well, widespread impact. And how many people were initially arrested in these actions, based on the reports you saw?
The number cited is at least 44 individuals taken into custody during that initial sweep.
Okay. And the official reason given for these arrests, what did they say?
The reasons stated by the authorities was simply immigration violations, which is, pretty standard language for this kind of operation.
Right, but the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, which oversees ICE, they characterized the individuals arrested in a specific way right from the start, didn't they?
Oh, they did. DHS immediately put out a statement saying that those arrested included gang members and criminals. That framing, it was clearly intended to, justify the operation and portray the targets in a certain light from the get-go.
Okay, so you have these targeted raids on Friday, dozens of arrests, and then DHS quickly provides this justification. How did communities and local officials react to this?
The reaction was swift. And according to the sources, it immediately provoked protests. And not just in LA, it quickly spread across the country, cities like Seattle, Austin, Chicago, Washington, D.C., as well as right there in LA itself.
Wow, that quickly. It just shows how sensitive this issue is and how rapidly information about enforcement actions can travel and, well, mobilize people.
Absolutely. And from the very beginning, the sources highlight a contrast in the nature of these demonstrations.
What kind of contrast did the sources describe? Peaceful versus...
Exactly. Some demonstrations were described as relatively peaceful, people gathering, chanting slogans, holding signs, just exercising their fundamental right to protest publicly.
But that wasn't the whole story, even early on.
No, definitely not. The sources note that other demonstrations right from the jump involved clashes with police and led to immediate arrests. So you had this kind of mixed picture of protest unfolding simultaneously in different locations.
And what about the reaction from local elected officials, particularly mayors across the LA region? What did they have to say?
This is where you see a significant political pushback. Mayors from various cities across Los Angeles actually banded together, issuing a unified statement.
That's a powerful collective voice. What was their message?
They directly demanded that the Trump administration stop what they called these stepped-up immigration raids, stating pretty unequivocally that these actions were spreading fear across their cities. They felt the raids were just casting too wide a net and, frankly, terrifying innocent residents.
And they didn't just make a general statement, did they? They cited specific examples of people who were reportedly detained, examples that seem to kind of contradict that DHS framing.
Yes, exactly. They highlighted cases that really drove home the human impact, mentioning a woman who was 9 months pregnant and a man who was detained while simply dropping off his granddaughter. These examples were used to argue that the raids weren't just targeting hardened criminals.
And the mayor of Southgate, Maria Davila, had a particularly poignant quote noted in the sources.
She did. Mayor Davila was quoted saying, "We are not criminals. We are hardworking people." That line really encapsulates the community's feeling of being unfairly targeted and, well, criminalized.
So you have local leaders pushing back hard, highlighting vulnerability, fear, saying these are hardworking people.
Yeah.
How did the federal government, specifically DHS, respond to this specific criticism from the mayors? Did they address it?
DHS didn't back down at all from their initial framing. They responded by essentially doubling down. They used the arrests of individuals with specific criminal convictions to support their portrayal of the targets.
And what kind of convictions did DHS highlight? Serious stuff.
The sources mentioned DHS pointing to arrests of individuals with convictions for serious crimes, including homicide, burglary, drug trafficking, and child endangerment. They used these examples to argue that violent criminals were indeed primary targets of these operations.
And they directly challenged the mayors and the state's leadership too, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. A DHS spokesperson, Tricia McLaughlin, was quoted directly questioning Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass, asking how they could prioritize criminal illegal aliens over their own citizens. It's a really clear illustration of the narrative battle that was taking place immediately after the raids.
So right from this initial spark, we see two completely contrasting narratives emerging from the sources. The federal government framing it as necessary enforcement against criminals, and local leaders framing it as terrifying, unfairly targeting hardworking people, creating widespread fear. That really sets the stage for the escalation we saw next.
It absolutely does. It shows how quickly the issue became this high-stakes political and social conflict, rooted in fundamentally different views of who is being targeted and whether the actions are justified at all.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, because those initial kind of scattered protests quickly swelled, particularly right there in Los Angeles over the weekend.
They definitely grew significantly. According to the sources, over that weekend and then into the beginning of the following week, Sunday and Monday, the demonstrations just expanded dramatically in terms of numbers.
How large did they actually become? We talking hundreds, thousands?
They swelled to several thousand demonstrators, so a much, much larger presence on the streets than those initial reactions on Friday.
And the nature of the activities also broadened and, well, intensified during this escalation, right? It wasn't just marching.
Yes. The sources describe a real mix. You still had elements of peaceful protest, people marching, holding rallies, chanting, that sort of thing. But alongside that, there was widespread vandalism, significant damage to cars, police vehicles, public buses.
And this naturally led to more direct confrontation with authorities.
Precisely. Clashes with police became more frequent and intense, leading to hundreds of arrests over this period. Police also resorted to using chemical irritants like tear gas or pepper spray, to disperse crowds.
Let's maybe pull out some specific scenes described in the sources because they really paint a vivid picture of the unfolding unrest. One incident that seemed to capture a lot of attention was the police cruiser being set on fire in Santa Monica.
Yeah, that description from the sources is quite striking. It wasn't just like a quick event either. They detail how the cruiser's horn started honking uncontrollably for about 15 minutes, almost like a dying animal, before things escalated further.
Then the windows were smashed, tires slashed.
Right, and then they describe how rags were soaked in some kind of flammable liquid and used to ignite the vehicle, just turning it into a blazing wreck.
One source even offered a really intense perspective on watching that fire, describing it as a spiritual experience or a beautiful cleansing burn. I mean, that kind of language shows the depth of emotion and perceived significance for some participants, starkly contrasting with, an official view of just destruction.
It really highlights the vastly different interpretations of the same act. And importantly, this happened in Santa Monica, an area the sources describe as a seaside luxury resort. The location itself seems significant.
It definitely seems the unrest wasn't confined to specific neighborhoods. The sources noted the targeting of affluent areas and businesses across the city.
Yes. Places like the Santa Monica Seaside Resort itself, the high-end outdoor mall, the Grove, iconic luxury shopping areas like Rodeo Drive, and busy districts like Fairfax were all mentioned as areas seeing unrest and property damage.
And specific stores were hit across this range of locations, not just high-end ones.
Exactly. While places like Nordstrom, Apple, Gucci, and Hermes were targeted, so were more common retail stores and banks like CVS, Walgreens, REI, Shoe Palace, and Citibank. It wasn't just about luxury goods, it seemed to be broader than that.
And the messages of the protests were literally visible on walls and buildings through graffiti. What did the sources mention seeing?
Definitely. Sources noted phrases like defund LAPD, the revolution is coming, and the anti-police acronym ACAB appearing. Even a phrase like dying for an opportunity was seen scrawled on a Citibank branch. Powerful messages.
And simpler acts of disruption, too, like fires?
Yes, descriptions of massive trash fires in the middle of Fairfax Boulevard add to the picture of widespread disruption and, well, chaos in certain areas.
Given this mix of activities, from peaceful marching to property destruction and clashes, the sources also delve into how authorities and observers tried to distinguish between different types of people on the street. That must have been difficult.
That's a critical distinction many sources tried to make, yeah. LA Police Chief Jim McDonnell was quoted specifically separating peaceful protesters exercising their First Amendment rights from, well, other groups.
He used terms like professional rioters or anarchists looking for a fight.
Right. The idea presented is that there were different motivations at play. Some people were there solely to protest the immigration actions or police practices peacefully, while others seemed intent on confrontation and causing damage, potentially co-opting the protest for their own ends.
And the sources identified specific activist groups that were reported to be involved in or at least commenting on the protests.
Yes, we see mentions of several organizations, each with their own stated goals and methods. One prominent group mentioned is Unión del Barrio.
Okay, Unión del Barrio. What was their perspective on the raids and the subsequent unrest, according to the sources?
Ron Gochez, representing the group, framed the ICE raids as a direct attack against our people. And he described their actions during the protests as resisting ICE terror. He even drew a pretty strong comparison to the situation in Gaza.
Wow. And they claim to have actively intervened during the raids themselves.
Yes, Gochez is quoted saying they actually combated agents in the streets for several hours, which he claimed ultimately forced the agents to retreat and allowed workers to escape. Their stated goal is centered around La Raza, fighting for Latin American immigrants, and they claim to be self-financed through their membership.
That's a very different approach from another group mentioned, the National Day Laborer Organizing Network, or NDLAN.
Correct. Pablo Alvarado, their co-executive director, took a distinctly different stance regarding the violence and property damage that occurred.
How did he view it? Did he condemn it?
He specifically condemned the violence and looting, arguing it was counterproductive and actually hurts the vulnerable communities and low-income businesses that the protests were ostensibly meant to support. NDLAN, whose mission is to support day laborers, migrants, and low-wage workers, really emphasizes nonviolent methods for achieving their goals of respect, peace, harmony, and justice. They operate as a 501c3 nonprofit, funded by donations.
Okay, so different tactics there. Then there's the Party for Socialism and Liberation, PSL. Their perspective presented in the sources seems quite radical.
It is. PSL self-identifies as Marxists, focused on the working class and oppressed people. They view these events through the lens of basically overthrowing capitalism in favor of socialism, stating quite explicitly that revolution is a necessity and a right, so their participation is framed within this much larger goal.
And one source noted potential external ties for PSL, something about funding.
Yes. It was reported in one source that PSL has ties to something called the Singham Network, which is associated with Neville Roy Singham, an American businessman living in China, who apparently has connections to the Chinese Communist Party.
A notable detail about their potential network and funding, according to that source anyway. What about the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles, RLA? They're presented as a key player in immigrant advocacy in LA.
Yeah, CHIRLA is identified as a significant organization focused on helping undocumented immigrants avoid deportation. And it's noted as receiving substantial financial resources, including taxpayer dollars through government grants.
But their reported involvement in the specific unrest we're discussing, the weekend stuff, was limited.
Yes. CHIRLA denied being involved in the volatile weekend demonstrations. They stated their participation was limited to a pre-planned rally they held the Thursday before the IC raids even occurred.
Okay, so beyond these organized groups, the sources give us a sense of the diverse motivations and messages from the individual protesters just out there on the street.
You definitely hear that diversity reflected in the chants and the signs people were carrying. Some chants were directly aimed at the enforcement actions, things like ICE out of LA National Guard, go away.
Others express clear anti-police sentiment, like, fuck the police, pretty direct.
Very direct.
Yeah.
And significantly, chants link these events to the broader national conversation about police brutality and racial injustice, echoing phrases like, hands up, don't shoot, and I can't breathe, which sadly gained prominence in other protests across the country.
The signs also conveyed a really wide range of messages, didn't they?
Signs varied hugely, from personal declarations like "Soy la voz de mi familia," I am my family's voice, to broader political statements like "Hate never made America great." Some explicitly connected to the Black Lives Matter movement, showing solidarity or drawing parallels like "Never again" displayed with names of black men killed by police, or even more confrontational messages like "Cops can eat a dick."
And just direct expressions of identity and grievance. Stop killing us. I am black. I'm human.
Exactly. You also have quotes from leaders like Patrisse Cullors and Melina Abdullah, co-founders of Black Lives Matter LA, framing the events as an uprising for Black life and asserting the right to be angry in the face of injustice.
One particular perspective highlighted in the LA Magazine source even offered a stark reinterpretation of the looting activity itself.
Yes, that source presented the viewpoint that looting wasn't necessarily mere criminality, but could actually be interpreted as a protest against capitalism. It's a framing that connects the property damage directly to a critique of the economic system itself. Pretty provocative.
And importantly, the sources noted that the crowds weren't homogenous. It wasn't just one group. A multiracial coalition was observed among the protesters.
That observation is key. It suggests that while the trigger might have been immigration enforcement, the energy on the street drew from a much broader range of grievances and identities coming together in that moment.
So you have this sequence: the initial ICE raids, the swift reaction, the escalation into larger, more complex protests with varied actors and tactics. This naturally leads to the question, how did the authorities respond to this escalating situation? Because they certainly did respond.
That brings us squarely to the official response,
Yeah.
which, as the sources detail, involved a significant display of force, intense political conflict, and legal battles playing out at multiple levels of government. A whole lot going on.
Let's start with the actions of law enforcement on the ground during the protests. What was the scale of arrests in Los Angeles? Were there many?
The Los Angeles Police Department reported making nearly 400 arrests and detentions, starting from when the protests really expanded that Saturday.
Nearly 400.
Yeah.
And what were the majority of those arrests for? Just being there.
The vast majority, over 200 according to the police reports cited, were for failure to leave the area or violations of the city's curfew. So this shows a clear focus on controlling movement and space, trying to quell the demonstrations.
But were there also more serious charges being filed, not just curfew violations?
Yes. While the majority were for curfew or dispersal orders, sources do note that charges also included more serious offenses like assault against police officers, possession of weapons like a Molotov cocktail or a gun, and even shining lasers at police vehicles or helicopters.
And police used specific methods to control the crowds, less lethal options.
The sources explicitly mention the police using numerous less lethal munitions, things like beanbag rounds or chemical irritants during confrontations with demonstrators.
Unfortunately, officers were also injured during these events, weren't they?
Yes. Reports indicated that 2 officers were injured on a specific Tuesday, bringing the total number of officer injuries sustained over several days of protests up to 9.
The legal system also stepped up to process and respond to the unrest. The DA got involved.
Right. The Los Angeles District Attorney, Nathan Hochman, stated his clear intent to file dozens of criminal cases against those he specifically categorized as peaceful protest disruptors.
He seemed keen to draw a line, differentiating between legitimate protest and criminal acts.
Exactly. The DA was quoted stating that while peaceful demonstration is a constitutional right, the moment people engage in illegal acts like theft or violence, they are no longer, in his view, legitimate First Amendment protesters, but are instead criminals. That was his distinction.
And he highlighted specific types of incidents they were targeting for prosecution, looking at evidence.
Yes, he mentioned reviewing video evidence to bring charges in cases involving suspects allegedly shooting fireworks at police officers or individuals accused of driving motorcycles into lines of officers. The potential charges included serious ones like assault, grand theft, and felony vandalism.
Beyond local charges, there were also federal charges related to some of the more serious acts, particularly involving destructive devices like Molotov cocktails.
That's right. The sources mentioned federal charges and arrests for individuals like Emiliano Garduno Galvez and Racky Keogh, specifically related to the use of Molotov cocktails.
The U.S. attorney had a pretty blunt statement about that, didn't he?
He did. U.S. Attorney Bill Asaley was quoted saying pretty straightforwardly, you can make a statement, but you can't throw bombs or Molotov cocktails. There were also federal assault charges mentioned for individuals like Christian Andres Garcia and Rene Luna for allegedly throwing objects at federal officers or facilities.
And importantly, the federal government framed these specific arrests within their broader narrative about the unrest, tying it back to the initial raids.
They absolutely did. DHS specifically reiterated their position, framing individuals like Garduno Galvez as criminal illegal aliens that rioters are fighting to protect. This reinforces their argument that the enforcement actions and the subsequent protests were linked by a common thread of, in their view, criminality.
Moving beyond the arrests and charges, the official response also involved implementing broader restrictive measures like curfews and mobilizing significant military and paramilitary forces. This seemed like a major escalation.
This was a huge point of escalation and conflict, yeah. Curfews were put in place to try and control the streets. Mayor's Base, for instance, implemented a curfew specifically for a section of downtown Los Angeles.
And how was that enforced? Was it effective?
The sources described the curfew enforcement as swift, with police making arrests pretty much moments after it took effect. They also noted that fewer clashes were observed in that specific downtown area on subsequent nights, suggesting the curfew did have some impact on the level of unrest there, at least.
And then came the deployment of military assets, which became a really significant point of contention.
Yes, Governor Newsom authorized the deployment of the California National Guard. Over 2,000 Guard troops were sent to the LA area. That's a lot of troops.
And some of those troops had a specific type of training relevant to the initial trigger event, the ICE raids.
That's right, about 500 of the Guard troops deployed to LA were noted as having received training specifically to accompany agents on immigration raids, and some had apparently already participated in such missions before.
But the federal government also mobilized forces, separate from the Guard.
Yes, 700 active-duty Marines were mobilized in the LA area. However, according to the sources, they were kept off the streets for the time being and were reportedly undergoing civil disturbance training.
And this entire military deployment, Guard and Marines, came with a significant price tag.
A Pentagon official provided an estimate, stating the cost of deploying both the Marines and the National Guard troops to Los Angeles was approximately $134 million. Not cheap.
The decision to mobilize Marines, in particular, seemed to raise some eyebrows, some concerns among experts quoted in the sources.
It definitely did. Mike Hillman, who's described as a law enforcement consultant and military veteran, was quoted expressing serious concerns about the suitability of Marines for domestic roles like this.
What was his reasoning? Why the concern?
He stated that Marines are fundamentally warfighters, trained for combat operations abroad, not typically for domestic law enforcement or crowd control. He warned that putting them in this kind of civil disturbance role has potentially serious consequences because it's just not what they're primarily trained or equipped for.
There was also a moment of confusion regarding statements from the commander overseeing the combined Guard and Marine task force, wasn't there?
Yes, Major General Scott Sherman initially made an incorrect statement, telling reporters that Guard troops had already temporarily detained civilians. He later had to correct this, clarifying that he had based his statement on images that weren't actually from the LA events. Bit of a misstep there.
He did, however, comment on the expected trajectory of the situation, right?
He did. He stated that he expected the protest situation would likely escalate, noting that protests were being planned in other locations across the nation as well.
And speaking of future actions, the sources also reported on specific plans by ICE to deploy specialized units to other cities beyond LA.
Yes. There was a reported ICE plan to deploy their Special Response Teams, or SRTs, to 5 specific cities led by Democratic mayors: Seattle, Chicago, Philadelphia, Northern Virginia, and New York.
And these SRTs aren't just standard ICE agents, are they? They're more tactical.
No, exactly. The sources describe SRTs as tactical units that utilize specialized equipment, like armored Bearcat vehicles, long guns, tactical vests. They are trained for high-risk operations. And importantly, the sources noted that these SRT units were used in the initial LA raids that triggered the protests, highlighting their potentially provocative nature.
Wow. Okay, this brings us to the high-level political and legal battle that played out simultaneously with everything happening on the street, a whole other layer.
This was a major front in the overall conflict, absolutely. Governor Newsom of California issued a very, very strong condemnation of President Trump's order to deploy military support for ICE agents.
What were Governor Newsom's main criticisms? What terms did he use?
He called the order a blatant abuse of power, illegal and damaging, and characterized it as a drastic and chaotic escalation that was completely unnecessary. He argued it would tarnish LA's image and actively heighten tensions in civil unrest, not calm them.
And Newsom didn't just criticize, he took legal action, right? He sued.
That's right. Governor Newsom filed a lawsuit seeking to halt the federal deployment of military assistance for ICE agents, arguing the president's order was both illegal and unconstitutional, a direct legal challenge.
How did the Trump administration respond to Newsom's legal challenge? Did they back down?
Not at all. They fired back, dismissing Newsom's lawsuit as a crass political stunt that was, in their words, endangering American lives. Their legal argument was that the president possesses lawful authority stemming from both statute and the Constitution to protect federal personnel and facilities. A court hearing on Newsom's request to block the deployment was scheduled for Thursday, so it was moving fast.
This legal and political conflict wasn't confined to just California and the federal government, though. It drew in officials from all across the country.
It really became a clear illustration of the national political divide. A coalition of 18 Democratic state attorneys general issued a statement condemning the federal deployment, calling it unlawful, unconstitutional, and undemocratic, and expressed their full support for Governor Newsom's lawsuit.
While a different group of state AGs took the exact opposite stance.
Yes, a coalition of 19 Republican attorneys general, joined by Guam, filed a brief supporting President Trump's actions. They argue the federal actions were responsible, constitutional, and fully authorized by existing law, completely opposing views.
We also saw reactions from other state and local leaders outside of California, reflecting similar tensions, didn't we?
We did. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, for example, deployed the Texas National Guard across his entire state to ensure peace and order, explicitly stating that he wanted to prevent what has happened in California from occurring in Texas, a preemptive move.
Even in cities that hadn't actually requested the Guard.
Yes. The mayor of San Antonio, Ron Nirenberg, publicly stated that city officials had not asked for the Guard to be sent there ahead of planned protests in his city. Houston Mayor John Whitmire also commented, saying his city was prepared.
And a local official in Nebraska offered a perspective on the impact of the raids themselves in his community, the initial trigger.
Yet Douglas County Commissioner Roger Garcia described the ICE raids there as incredibly sad, stating they caused palpable fear throughout the community and even led Latino-owned businesses to temporarily close their doors out of concern for their workers and themselves.
On the national political stage, Democratic leaders in Congress also weighed in pretty strongly.
Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries both defended Governor Newsom and the right to peaceful protest, while also, importantly, condemning the violence that occurred during some of the demonstrations.
Other senators expressed concern specifically about the military deployments themselves.
Right. Senator Chris Coons criticized the deployment of untrained Marines and National Guard members into a domestic situation, echoing those concerns we mentioned earlier that Marines are trained for combat, not law enforcement. And Senator Chris Murphy pressed Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth on what he perceived as a double standard in the federal response, compared to how authorities handled the January 6th Capitol attack, bringing up that comparison.
The White House, meanwhile, maintained that President Trump supported peaceful protests, despite some of his own rhetoric maybe suggesting otherwise.
Yes, despite previous comments from the president threatening things like very big force, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt insisted he supports peaceful protests. The sources noted that when a reporter pressed her on what constitutes an acceptable protest, she reportedly called the question stupid.
We even saw international reactions reported in the sources, crossing borders.
Yeah, Mexico City President Claudia Sheinbaum publicly rejected an accusation from DHS Secretary Noem that she had called for violence, calling the accusation completely false and reiterating her own support for peaceful protests.
And a notable public figure, Kim Kardashian, added her voice to the discussion, too.
Right. Kim Kardashian made a statement condemning what she called the inhumane treatment of immigrants, emphasizing their contributions to Los Angeles and saying communities thrive because of them. She stated their has to be a better way to handle these situations.
So this whole section really lays out the official response, which was this complex combination of law enforcement action on the ground, implementing control measures like curfews, the really controversial deployment of military and paramilitary forces, and a fierce political and legal battle playing out at the highest levels, all fueled by the events unfolding on the streets.
Absolutely. It shows how the state responded with significant power and resources while simultaneously engaging in this intense battle to control the narrative and justify its actions against some pretty strong political and legal opposition.
What's really fascinating here as we move deeper is how the sources connect these immediate events we've discussed. The raids, the protests, the response to deeper layers of history and lived experience in LA. It says you can't truly understand the intensity or the nature of what happened without considering this context.
So right. The sources, either implicitly or sometimes very explicitly, draw parallels to past moments of significant unrest in Los Angeles, highlighting that these events aren't just happening in a vacuum. There's a history here.
And the most prominent historical parallel drawn is often to the 1965 Watts riots, right?
A profoundly impactful event in LA's history, definitely. While it was triggered by a specific incident, a police traffic stop involving Marquette Fry for suspected drunk driving, the riots were fundamentally driven by much deeper, long-standing grievances within the Black community.
Grievances like police abuse, discrimination, poverty, those sorts of things.
Exactly. And also really systemic issues like residential segregation, enforced through restrictive covenants and practices like blockbusting, which severely limited where Black residents could live and thrive. The Watts riots resulted in significant casualties, massive property damage, and importantly for comparison, the involvement of the National Guard to restore order.
And then, of course, there are the 1992 Rodney King riots. Another huge moment.
Another pivotal moment for LA, triggered by the acquittal of LAPD officers filmed brutally beating Rodney King. That unrest also led to widespread casualties and immense property damage across the city, unforgettable for anyone who lived through it.
The LA Magazine source we looked at explicitly connects these past events to the present moment we're discussing.
It absolutely does. That source argues that the city's militarized legacy, the 50-year-old traumas from events like Watts, and what it calls the gruesome lineage of such unrest fundamentally inform and shape the current moment. The idea is that the past isn't just history, it's part of the present reality, influencing how people react and how authorities respond.
It really makes you think about how historical patterns of policing, segregation, inequality, how they can just echo through generations and contribute to current tensions.
It really does. And speaking of lived experience, that LA Magazine source provides a really raw first-person account of being arrested during the recent protests, which offers a completely different view than the official reports or statistics.
Yeah, that account is quite detailed and very personal. What was that experience like for the author, according to the source? It sounds harrowing.
The author describes being kind of swept up in an arrest sweep, being immediately handcuffed with these painful zip tie restraints, and having their belongings, wallet, keys, phone just unceremoniously taken away. They specifically note that their Miranda rights were not read during the arrest process.
They also mentioned trying to identify themselves as a journalist, didn't they? But it didn't help.
Yes. They state they attempted to tell police they were a journalist, but felt their status was just completely ignored. The author perceived that in that moment, police were not concerned with objective truth or abstractions of the Constitution, as they put it.
And they felt there was a distinction in who police were focused on arresting, protesters versus others.
Yeah, they describe observing police seeming indifferent to potential looters in nearby alleyways, while actively focusing on arresting people who appeared to be engaged in protesting. That was their perception from the ground.
The conditions after arrest also sound quite harsh, according to this account, not pleasant at all.
No. Being made to stand frozen against a wall with others, feeling like cattle. The increasing physical pain from the tight zip tie cuffs, described as digging deep into their wrists. Then being transported in a sheriff's department bus, the author sarcastically labeled the Corona Express, highlighting the, pandemic context.
And what were the conditions like inside that bus? Crowded?
They describe it as a cramped and filthy metal cage, being forced to sit practically on top of a cellmate due to the sheer overcrowding. They note that only about half the detainees were wearing masks, and police weren't providing any protective gear, despite the clear risk of viral spread in such close quarters.
They even had conversations with other people who had been arrested on the bus.
Yes, the author talked with a cellmate who explained he was there with his girlfriend, because they felt it was important to make their voices heard during the protest. They also overheard others, including one person who was rapping, "Fuck the police."
And it was during one of these conversations that the alternative perspective on looting came up again, the protest against capitalism idea.
Exactly. The cellmate apparently calmly stated, in relation to the property damage they might have witnessed, that's just a protest against capitalism. This reinforces that viewpoint presented elsewhere in the sources, seeing the destruction not simply as senseless crime, but as a symbolic act against the economic system itself.
Eventually, the author was released from custody after all that.
Yes. After hours of waiting and enduring the physical discomfort, the author's name was finally called. They described the relief of having the zip-tie cuffs cut off as just heavenly. I can only imagine.
And what was the ultimate outcome of that arrest? Did they face charges?
Despite the entire ordeal of detention, the author was simply given a curfew citation and told to appear in court. But then the source adds that days later, the LA City Attorney announced that none of those arrested solely for curfew violations would actually be prosecuted. So arrested, detained, cited, then charges dropped.
Wow. That specific account really provides such a stark contrast to the official narrative of just arresting criminals or professional rioters. It highlights the experience of being caught up in the dragnet and the physical and psychological impact of that whole process.
It absolutely does. It brings the abstract concept of arrests down to a very tangible human level, showing the messiness and the feeling of being subjected to state power in that kind of chaotic environment. It's a powerful perspective.
The source also included other observations that contributed to this picture of the scene beyond just the arrest experience. Little details.
Yes, details like the description of sniper rifles being trained on protesters from the roof of the Westwood Federal Building. That adds to the sense of a heavy, almost intimidating federal presence. And the mention of the ACLU describing downtown's men's central jail as a modern-day medieval dungeon paints a pretty grim picture of the potential outcome for those who were arrested on more serious charges and weren't just released with a dropped citation.
And circling back to that idea of looting as a protest against capitalism, the source also offered a perspective on who the true victims might be, kind of challenging conventional thinking.
Right. The source suggested that the real victims might not be individual store owners as much as the large insurance companies, described somewhat cynically as having money bins of cash. The argument presented is that property owners are often the quickest and loudest to condemn property damage, perhaps overlooking deeper systemic issues that might be at play. It's a viewpoint that definitely reframes the impact and significance of the looting.
Finally, despite all the property damage, the source noted a significant difference from the '92 riots in terms of human cost, which is important.
Yes. The author explicitly highlights that despite the significant property damage, vastly fewer people died in this recent unrest compared to the devastation of '92. They point out that in a city of almost 4 million people, not a single person died during this particular period of unrest, which is a really critical distinction compared to historical events like Watts or '92.
This section really underscores how these events are just viewed through such different lenses, officials calling participants criminals or rioters, while participants and some observers view their actions as resistance, an uprising, or even a critique of the system itself. How these different narratives exist simultaneously really shapes our understanding, doesn't it?
It highlights the deeply subjective nature of interpreting social upheaval and the conflict inherent in describing who is doing what and why during moments of intense civil unrest. The sources clearly show us these competing interpretations are absolutely fundamental to the story. There's no single simple truth here.
So, okay, we've gone through the inciting events, the escalation of protests, the massive official response from the streets to the courtrooms, and explored these important layers of history and lived experience that inform it all. Bringing all of this information from the sources together, what are the key insights? What does this deep dive really tell us about what it all means?
Well, if we try and distill what these sources are presenting, several key insights seem to emerge. First, regarding policy and enforcement. This deep dive really reveals that current immigration enforcement strategies, particularly the use of targeted, tactical units like ICE's Special Response Teams, those SRTs we mentioned, and coordinated raids on workplaces and communities can be highly volatile triggers.
It's not just the policy of enforcement itself, but the method that really matters.
Precisely. The sources show how this tactical escalation directly provoked the initial protests in LA, suggesting that the how of enforcement can be just as significant a spark for unrest as the underlying policy itself. especially when it's layered onto existing community anxieties and that deep historical context we discussed.
Okay, that's one takeaway. Second, looking at the dynamic between protest and response. The sheer variety of tactics on the street, everything from peaceful assembly to vandalism and confrontation, alongside the state's very heavy response, including curfews and military deployments, it really highlights the increasingly maybe fractured nature of civil discourse.
Yeah, it shows the tension between the right to dissent and the state's perceived need for absolute order, sometimes enforced with significant, even overwhelming force. The sources illustrate how easily the lines can blur between legitimate protest and unlawful acts in these volatile situations, and crucially, how different actors interpret that line completely differently.
Third, the high-level political and legal battle between the federal government and state-local officials like Governor Newsom. It isn't just about this specific incident, is it? It clearly illustrates deeper political and ideological divides at play in the country.
Oh, absolutely. It's a conflict rooted not just in immigration policy, but in fundamental disagreements over federal power versus state autonomy, different visions of public safety, and whose priority should come first perceived national security threats versus the well-being and, frankly, the fear felt by local communities. The lawsuits and the political statements are really symptoms of this profound clash in governance philosophies presented in the sources.
And fourth, maybe most importantly, the sources constantly tie these immediate events back to broader, long-standing issues. They don't let them exist in isolation.
They absolutely do. By drawing parallels to the Watts and Rodney King riots, discussing police practices, and even interpreting property damage through the lens of economic inequality and a protest against capitalism, the sources show that these events are rooted in deep, unresolved societal traumas and inequities. These aren't just isolated incidents, they are eruptions stemming from that gruesome lineage, as one source put it, of historical and systemic problems in American cities.
So why is understanding these complex events through these multiple perspectives from the sources important for you, the listener? Why should people care about unpacking all this?
Because in our information-saturated world, with competing narratives flying at us constantly, navigating complex events like these requires looking beyond just the simple headlines or a single viewpoint. It requires critically evaluating where the information is coming from, understanding the potential biases or framings involved, and synthesizing different accounts, official statements, on-the-ground experiences, historical context to build a more complete, more nuanced picture. It's really about strengthening your critical thinking skills.
And it helps you understand the powerful forces, historical, economic, political, that are shaping the society you live in every day.
Precisely. These events are symptoms of larger forces at work. Seeing them from multiple angles, informed by the details and viewpoints provided in these sources, gives you a richer, more nuanced understanding of the dynamics that impact communities, policies, and ultimately the fabric of American society.
Absolutely. Well, that wraps up this deep dive into the sources surrounding the recent events in Los Angeles. It's been a lot to cover.
It has. We've gone from the initial ICE raids that sparked everything, through the escalation of protests with their diverse participants and tactics, explored the multi-layered official response on the streets and in the courts, and connected it all to the vital historical context and powerful lived experiences presented in the sources.
It's a lot to take in, but seeing the range of perspectives and details really highlights the sheer complexity of what happened. No easy answers.
It certainly does. It makes you think about the interplay between policy, community reaction, historical grievances, and the exercise of state power, all colliding.
And on that note, here's a thought to perhaps consider based on everything we've discussed from these sources. How do the historical roots of unrest in places like Watts, driven by issues like police abuse and systemic inequality, continue to shape and maybe even intensify reactions to current events like immigration enforcement actions and protests today? Are we seeing history echo or maybe even repeat in the present?
Or maybe consider that idea presented in the sources about looting as a protest against capitalism. What does that perspective, emerging from the ground during the unrest, suggest about the role of economic inequality in fueling different forms of protest and shaping the dynamics of civil unrest in our cities today? Is it just crime or something more?
Important questions to keep pondering as you process information about current events. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure. Always fascinating to dig into the sources.
Until next time, keep diving deep.